The scent of dust and gasoline clung to the cold morning air like an unwelcome visitor. Clara Lee's phone rang with a violent urgency, tearing through the fragile silence of her Queens apartment. She jolted awake, disoriented, her hair a tangle around her face. "Clara, you have to come now," a frantic voice cried on the other end. It was Marco, one of her father's oldest apprentices, who had stayed behind to look after the old neighborhood. "They're here, the demolition crew. They're tearing everything down." Her heart stuttered. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the framed photograph on the nightstand, her father smiling beneath the shade of a centuries-old sycamore tree, the very tree that stood at the corner of East 75th, the unofficial heart of the historic district. He had dedicated his life to protecting that place, brick by brick, stone by stone, and now she didn't even finish the thought. She threw on the first coat she could find, snatched her keys, and rushed out the door. The streets blurred past as she drove, every red light an unbearable obstacle. By the time she reached the old neighborhood, a thick haze of smoke and dust rolled into the morning sky. The sound of heavy machinery clawing through brick and mortar roared in her ears. Clara slammed the car door shut and ran. Her boots slipped on loose gravel. The crowd of residents stood pressed against the barricades, their faces painted with shock, anger, and grief. Children clung to their mothers, elderly men shook their heads, and someone shouted in desperation, "Stop! You can't do this." Clara pushed her way forward, her pulse hammering, until she saw him. Daniel Storm, her ex-husband, the man who had once held her dreams in his hands and crushed them without a second thought. He stood tall and immovable in his tailored black coat, his presence commanding the sight like a general at war. His sharp jawline was set in determination, his piercing eyes hidden behind sunglasses, and his lips moved briskly as he barked orders into a headset. "Clear the north wing first. We need this entire block down by noon. Investors are flying in this weekend. I want clean ground by then." Clara froze. Time bent and warped around her. Memory surged, the warmth of his hand entwined with hers. The promises whispered in the dark, the arguments that shredded her soul, and the silence that finally split them apart. And now, here he was, tearing down not just walls of brick, but the remnants of her father's life's work. "Daniel!" she screamed, her voice breaking. The sound sliced through the chaos. Daniel lifted his head. For a moment, their eyes locked across the demolition site, hers burning with disbelief and fury. His unreadable behind the tint of his glasses. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he lowered the headset. He took a step closer, then another, until the din of machinery seemed to fade under the weight of their history. "Clara," he said at last, his voice calm, cold, and devastatingly familiar. "You shouldn't be here." She stared at him, chest heaving. "You're destroying it. My father's legacy. You're destroying everything." Daniel tilted his head, almost pitying. "It's just a collection of old buildings, crumbling unsafe. The city has outgrown this place. What I'm building will bring jobs, revenue, progress. Your father's sentimentality doesn't change the facts." Clara's nails dug into her palms. The sting grounded her, kept her from shattering. She had once believed in this man, had once tried to see the world through his ruthless logic. But this was unforgivable. "Progress," she spat. "You call this progress? You're erasing history, Daniel. You're erasing him." The crowd murmured in agreement, but Daniel didn't flinch. His empire had been built on ignoring opposition. "I'm erasing decay," he countered flatly. "The future isn't made by clinging to the past. It's built by tearing it down." For a beat, all Clara could hear was the thunder of her heart. The man she once loved stood before her, not as her partner, but as her enemy. He had always chosen money over meaning, power over principle. And now he was here, proving that nothing had changed, except she had. Clara squared her shoulders. If you go through with this, Daniel, you're not just fighting the city or the activists. You're fighting me. Something flickered across his face then, the briefest shadow of surprise, but it vanished as quickly as it came. His lips curved into a faint, dismissive smirk. You've been gone too long, Clara. This isn't your fight anymore. Her voice hardened. It's always been mine. The wind carried her words, weaving them into the dust-filled air. Around them, the machines kept moving, the ground shook, and history trembled on the brink of annihilation. But in that moment, the battle lines were drawn, not just for a neighborhood, but for the soul of two people who had once loved and lost, and who now stood on opposite sides of the same dream. Clara's heart clenched, but her resolve sharpened like steel. She had once walked away from her purpose for him. She would not do it again. This was not revenge. This was reclamation. For her father, for herself, for the legacy that deserved to survive. And if Daniel Storm wanted a war, she would give him one. The morning after the confrontation, Clara sat alone at her kitchen table, staring at the pile of architectural sketches she hadn't touched in years. The thin paper had yellowed at the edges, lines of graphite fading like ghosts of a passion she once lived for. She used to fill notebooks with blueprints and designs, her imagination spilling across the pages in shapes of columns, arches, and glass facades that merged history with innovation. But those notebooks had collected dust, buried in the back of her closet. Just like her dreams, she reached out, her fingers grazing the worn cover of one of them, but pulled back as though it might burn her. The memory of her father's voice tugged at her heart. Architecture isn't just about buildings, Clara. It's about preserving stories. Every stone tells one. Don't ever forget that. Her throat tightened. She had forgotten. Or rather, she had chosen to. 7 years ago, when she had still been Clara Storm, wife of the rising real estate magnate Daniel Storm, she thought she could balance both worlds, the world of heritage her father had instilled in her, and the dazzling empire Daniel was building. But as the years passed, Daniel's disdain for old bricks and sentiment chipped away at her resolve. He didn't just fail to understand her passion. He dismissed it outright, calling her ideals naive, unprofitable, childish. She remembered the night everything crumbled between them. They had sat in their penthouse overlooking Manhattan's glittering skyline. Clara had dared to bring up the subject of her father's ongoing restoration project in Queens, a neighborhood rich with pre-war brownstones that had narrowly survived the wrecking ball. She'd asked Daniel to help fund its preservation, to see it as more than a money pit. He'd laughed a sharp, cutting sound. Clara, darling, you really think people care about moldy buildings when they could be living in glass towers with rooftop pools? The world doesn't want nostalgia. It wants progress, and progress pays. That night, she realized he would never see the world through her eyes. And eventually, she stopped trying. Their divorce was quieter than their marriage had ever been. No screaming matches, no public scandals, just silence, paperwork, and the finality of signatures on a dotted line. She walked away with a modest settlement, more than enough for comfort, but not enough to make her feel she'd sold her soul. She traded skyscraper views for a small apartment and the fleeting hope that one day she might find herself again, but she hadn't. Years passed, and the fire within her dwindled to embers. She drifted from one design firm to another, taking jobs that paid the bills but never demanded her heart. When her father passed away 2 winters ago, she thought the grief would push her back into purpose. Instead, it hollowed her out further. She avoided the old neighborhood because it hurt too much. The sight of his workshop, the echoes of his voice in the cobbled alley was unbearable. Until yesterday. Until Daniel Storm, with his immaculate suit and his army of machines, stood at the gates of her father's legacy and swung the first blow. Clara rose abruptly from the table, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. She grabbed the notebook after all, clutching it to her chest like a lifeline. She couldn't let him take it away, not the buildings, not the stories, not the last piece of her father. Her phone buzzed. A flood of notifications from community groups, activists, and news outlets lit up the screen. Photos of the demolition site, videos of residents protesting, hashtags calling for the preservation of Queens' cultural heritage. And tucked among them was a message from Marco. "We can't do this without you. Clara, your father would have wanted you to fight." Clara exhaled shakily. The choice was already made. Meanwhile, across the river, Daniel Storm sat in the corner office of his skyscraper, the city stretching out beneath him like a conquest. The demolition report lay neatly on his desk. Phase 1 complete, 2 blocks cleared, investors reassured. Everything was proceeding according to plan, and yet, he couldn't shake the image of Clara's eyes from the day before, accusing alive in a way he hadn't seen in years. For a fleeting moment, it had unsettled him, but he brushed it off with a sip of his espresso. Clara was always sentimental, always too attached to the intangible. That was why she had walked away from him, from their life together. She wanted meaning where he saw profit, permanence where he thrived on change. Still, her defiance gnawed at him. The press had been there yesterday. Cameras flashing, journalists shouting questions, and Clara, standing before the rubble, looked less like an ex-wife and more like a symbol, a dangerous symbol. Daniel leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. If she wanted a fight, he would give her one. She had no resources, no investors, no leverage. He had an empire, and yet somewhere deep inside, buried beneath years of ambition and armor, there was a whisper of doubt. That night, Clara returned to her father's old workshop for the first time in years. The key was rusted, stiff in the lock, but the door creaked open with a sigh that felt almost like welcome. Dust motes swirled in the light of her flashlight, settling on the familiar outlines of drafting tables, rulers, and rolls of parchment. On the far wall hung her father's last sketch, a rendering of the neighborhood preserved, its brick facades lovingly detailed, its streets alive with families and markets. He had titled it simply, Legacy. Clara traced the lines with trembling fingers. She remembered how he used to work late into the night, humming softly as he drew, pausing only to sip his tea. He believed so fiercely that architecture was more than utility, was memory, identity, community. She had walked away from that belief once, for Daniel. But she wouldn't again, not now, not ever. Clara sat at the drafting table, pulled a fresh sheet of paper, and began to sketch. Her hands shook at first, rusty from disuse, but slowly the rhythm returned. She drew plans for preservation, layouts that combined historical integrity with modern sustainability, models that could rival Daniel's towers in vision, if not in scale. By the time dawn seeped through the cracked windows, Clara's sketches covered the table. For the first time in years, she felt alive. The battle for the neighborhood had begun. Clara didn't sleep. She couldn't. The adrenaline from the night spent in her father's workshop still pulsed through her veins as she walked into the small community. Centered the next morning, the place was buzzing. Local shop owners, families, and students from the nearby art school filled the cramped hall, their voices overlapping in anxious waves. Handwritten posters demanding Save Our Streets in Queens Heritage Matters plastered the walls. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and determination. When Clara stepped inside, the room quieted. For a moment, all eyes turned toward her. She felt the weight of expectation settle on her shoulders, heavier than any blueprint she had ever carried. Marco, a wiry man with salt and pepper hair who had been her father's closest friend, hurried over. His eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, but his smile was resolute. "You came," he said simply, gripping her hand. Clara nodded. "I couldn't stay away." Marco squeezed her fingers. "Your father would be proud." The words hit her square in the chest. Pride. For years she had lived without it, buried under compromises, silences, and the slow erosion of herself. But here, among these people, she felt it flicker again. Clara took a deep breath and addressed the crowd. I know many of you don't know me. I'm Clara Lee. My father, Richard Lee, spent his life working on these streets, fighting for these buildings. And now, they're under threat. She held up her sketches, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. But I believe we can save them. Not just for us, but for the generations to come. We can show the city that this neighborhood isn't just a plot of land to be bulldozed. It's a living story. Applause rippled through the room. Someone shouted, "We're with you." And the murmur of agreement grew louder, for the first time in years. Clara felt like she belonged. Across the city, Daniel was signing contracts in his pristine office when his assistant, Lydia, walked in with an iPad. "You need to see this," she said, setting it down on the desk. Daniel barely glanced up. "If it's another protest, I don't care. They always burn out. This one's different," Lydia pressed. "Clara's leading it." That caught his attention. His jaw tightened as he swiped through photos and clips. There she was, Clara, standing before a crowd, her sketches pinned to the wall, her words echoing with conviction. She looked nothing like the quiet, compliant woman he remembered. Her posture was fierce, her expression unyielding. The video had already gone viral, with hashtags demanding accountability from Storm Enterprises. Reporters were tagging the company in scathing posts about cultural erasure, questioning Daniel's moral responsibility. Daniel leaned back in his leather chair, expression unreadable. For a long moment, he watched the clip replay, Clara's eyes burning with a fire he hadn't seen in years. "She's getting traction," Lydia said carefully. "This could turn into a PR nightmare." Daniel smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Clara always had a flair for the dramatic, but she doesn't have the resources to fight me. This is a storm in a teacup." Still, even as he dismissed her, he couldn't shake the way her voice had cut through the screen. It wasn't just defiance, it was conviction, and conviction was dangerous. Back at the community center, Clara sat with Marco and a few volunteers, mapping out their next steps. "We'll need media coverage," Marco said. "Press releases, maybe even a rally. The city won't listen unless the public forces them to." "I can draft something," Clara offered, pulling out her notebook. Words weren't her weapon of choice, design was, but she could channel her father's belief in stories. "We need to humanize this place, show the faces behind the bricks." That night, Clara walked the neighborhood with her camera, photographing shopkeepers closing up their stores, children playing on cracked sidewalks, elderly couples sitting on stoops that had seen decades of history. Each click of the shutter captured not just images but memories. As she worked, the ache in her chest grew sharper. She remembered walking these same streets as a child, holding her father's hand, listening to him tell stories about the families who lived there. She had once dreamed of restoring these buildings with him, creating something that honored the past while embracing the future. Instead, she had chosen Daniel. She closed her eyes, guilt washing over her. She had walked away from her father's legacy for a man who couldn't even see its worth. And now that man was the one tearing it all down. 2 days later, Storm Enterprises held a press conference at the demolition site. Cameras clicked furiously as Daniel stepped up to the podium, immaculate in his tailored suit, exuding confidence. "This redevelopment project," he began smoothly, "will bring jobs, housing, and modern infrastructure to a neighborhood that has long been neglected. We are not destroying, we are renewing." Reporters scribbled furiously, but murmurs of skepticism buzzed among the crowd. Clara stood at the edge, hidden in the throng, her fists clenched. His words were like daggers dressed as promises. When a reporter asked about the protests, Daniel's smile sharpened. "A small group of idealists is trying to romanticize decay. I respect passion, but passion doesn't pay rent. Progress does." Clara felt the blood rush to her face. It was the same condescension, the same dismissal he had shown her years ago. She wanted to scream, but instead she turned and walked away. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. That evening, Clara uploaded a video compilation of her photos, layered with her voiceover. These streets are not just bricks and mortar. They are memories, livelihoods, and dreams. Once they're gone forever. This is not about nostalgia. It's about identity. It's about who we are. Within hours, the video exploded across social media. Journalists picked it up, residents shared it, and even local politicians began to weigh in. Clara watched the views climb into the thousands, then tens of thousands. For the first time, she felt like her father's voice was speaking through her, but she also knew this was just the beginning. Daniel wouldn't back down. He never did, and neither would she. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of her phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. Her inbox was flooded with messages, journalists requesting interviews, local activists offering support, even strangers sending words of encouragement. For a brief moment, she lay still, staring at the ceiling, letting it all sink in. She had wanted attention for the cause, but the speed at which it arrived was overwhelming. Could she carry this weight? Could she speak not just for herself, but for an entire community? Then she thought of her father, hunched over his drafting table, his hands stained with ink, whispering, "If you don't fight for what matters, Clara, no one else will." She rose from bed and opened her laptop. If this was the beginning of a storm, she would meet it head-on by noon. Clara was seated in a small radio station studio, headphones pressed against her ears. The host, a woman with a warm but incisive voice, leaned forward. "Clara, why do you believe this neighborhood should be saved?" Some people argue that redevelopment means progress. Clara's voice was calm, but her hands trembled under the table. Progress is not always about tearing down. True progress honors the past while building the future. This neighborhood is not just old buildings, it's a living museum of immigrant history, of working-class resilience. If we lose it, we lose part of ourselves. The host nodded, impressed. "And what do you say to Daniel Storm, who claims that you're clinging to decay?" Clara hesitated only a moment before answering. "Decay happens when you stop caring. My father cared. The people here care. This isn't about clinging, it's about preserving what gives us identity. Daniel may see numbers, but I see stories." The interview went viral before she even left the station. Hashtags trended, and comments poured in, praising her courage. But not everyone was supportive. A few trolls sneered about her being the bitter ex-wife of a billionaire, suggesting this was personal revenge, disguised as activism. Clara winced, but pressed on. She couldn't control the noise, only her actions. Meanwhile, in the glass tower of Storm Enterprises, Daniel watched the media frenzy unfold on his office screens. His jaw clenched tighter with each headline. David versus Goliath. Woman fights billionaire developer to save historic Queen's ex-wife of real estate mogul leads. Preservation battle. The board was restless. Investors called with concerns. Lydia, ever efficient, laid a stack of reports on his desk. Our approval ratings are slipping. Social media sentiment is at an all-time low. If this continues, city officials might reconsider permits. You need to address this, Daniel. Daniel exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. It's smoke. It'll fade. But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. Clara was not fading. She was gaining momentum. He swiveled his chair toward the window, staring at the sprawling skyline he had helped shape. He remembered the first time he had taken Clara up to the rooftop of their old apartment, years ago. She had pointed at the same skyline, her eyes bright with dreams. "Imagine," she had whispered, "restoring history instead of erasing it. We could build something that tells stories, not just makes money." Back then, he had laughed. He had kissed her forehead and told her dreams were sweet. But money built reality. He hadn't realized that in dismissing her dreams, he had been dismissing her now. Those same dreams stood in direct opposition to him. That evening Daniel attended a private dinner with investors. The room was all crystal chandeliers and polished silverware, but the mood was tense. One gray-haired man set down his glass with a sharp clink. "Daniel, this preservation activist, she's winning sympathy fast. Public opinion could derail the entire redevelopment. We need reassurance." Daniel forced a confident smile. "Gentlemen, you know me. I deliver results. Sentiment doesn't pay dividends, steel and glass do." But as he spoke, he caught a glimpse of Clara's face on the TV mounted in the corner of the restaurant. She was giving a speech at the community center, her voice steady, her eyes burning with conviction. For a fleeting moment, Daniel's facade cracked. He looked away quickly, lifting his glass in a toast, but inside unease twisted in his chest. Later that night, Clara sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through comments on her latest video. Support poured in, but so did vitriol. Some accused her of being naive. Others mocked her as the billionaire's ex with a grudge. She closed her laptop, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She hated that, no matter how hard she fought. Her past with Daniel was always dragged into the light. A soft knock at her door startled her. It was Marco, carrying a thermos of tea. "You're doing good work," he said, settling into the chair across from her. Clara shook her head. "They think this is about him, about us. But it's not. It's about my father, about this place. Why can't they see that?" Marco's gaze was gentle. "People see what they want. What matters is that you see the truth, and you fight for it. The rest will follow." She sipped the tea, letting its warmth steady her. Marco was right. She had to stay the course. No matter how loudly the world misinterpreted her motives, Daniel lay awake in his penthouse, the city glittering beneath him. He tried to drown out the noise with expensive scotch, but Clara's voice echoed in his mind. True progress honors the past while building the future. For the first time in years, he wondered if he had been wrong. Not about money, not about power, those he understood, but about her, about what she had wanted. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time he drifted, he saw her standing among crumbling buildings, defiant and unbroken, and he knew this fight was far from over. The morning air was sharp with the smell of rain-soaked pavement as Clara hurried across the square, a folder of sketches clutched under her arm. The community center had been transformed overnight from a quiet gathering spot into the headquarters of a movement. Posters covered the walls, volunteers typed furiously at laptops, and local artists painted banners that would soon hang across the neighborhood. Clara paused at the doorway, overwhelmed by the energy inside. She had always been comfortable in quiet studios, lost in lines and shadows of her drawings. Now she stood at the center of a storm, every eye turning to her for guidance. Marco caught her gaze and smiled. "Our general is here." She laughed softly, though her hands shook. "Don't call me that. I'm just trying to do what my father would have wanted." But Marco only shrugged. "Leadership isn't something you choose. It chooses you." Clara inhaled deeply and stepped into the room. "All right," she called, her voice steadying as it carried over the noise. "Let's get to work." By midday, she was seated before a panel of city heritage officials, her sketches spread out across the table. "These buildings," Clara began, tapping one drawing with her pen, "are not just shells. They're markers of migration, of cultural blending, of history written in stone and brick. This bakery here," she slid forward a photo of an aging storefront, "was opened in 1924 by Italian immigrants. It's still run by the same family. That's nearly a century of continuity." The officials exchanged looks, some skeptical, others intrigued. Clara pressed on. "Tourism studies show that preserved neighborhoods generate long-term revenue. You don't have to destroy history to create prosperity. You can build on it." When she finished, the room was silent. Then one official leaned forward. "You make a compelling case, Ms. Lee, but the developer has permits. Your evidence is strong, but without wider public support. Our hands are tied." Clara left the meeting both encouraged and frustrated. She knew she had struck a chord, but Daniel's reach was long, and his influence deeper than most could fathom. Meanwhile, in the sleek upper floors of Storm Enterprises, Daniel was reviewing demolition timelines when Lydia entered with a folder. "The preservation group presented to the city this morning," she reported. "The press is starting to pick it up. Clara Lee is becoming the face of this." Daniel's lips thinned. She always knew how to capture attention, but she doesn't understand scale. Sentiment doesn't win contracts. Lydia hesitated. Perhaps, but public sentiment does sway politics. If this escalates, it could stall our entire project. Investors are uneasy. Daniel's gaze hardened. Then calm them. Remind them I've never failed to deliver. Still, when Lydia left, Daniel found himself staring at the architectural sketches Clara had once drawn for him long ago, when they were still together. They'd been tucked away in his office, forgotten under layers of contracts and blueprints. He didn't know why he hadn't thrown them out. That evening, Clara stood in front of a camera crew, her heart pounding. A local news channel had come to cover the movement. The reporter adjusted the microphone. "Clara, what drives you to fight this battle, knowing the odds?" Clara glanced around at the crowd gathering behind her shopkeepers. Students, elderly residents clutching each other's arms. "Because this isn't just a battle about buildings. It's about people. My father believed a city without memory is a city without soul. I can't stand by while that soul is ripped out." The footage aired that night, and within hours, her words echoed across social media. Messages of support poured in from strangers across the country. Donations trickled into their small preservation fund. Clara felt hope ignite, but also fear. For every message of support, there were detractors. Anonymous accounts accused her of sabotaging progress, of acting out of spite against her ex. The shadow of her past with Daniel loomed over every step she took. Daniel watched the broadcast from his penthouse. Clara's voice filled the room, soft yet fierce, each word a rebuke of his vision. He poured himself a drink, staring at her image on the screen. She looked different from the woman he remembered, stronger, sharper, alive in a way she hadn't been in their years together. "Why now?" he muttered to the empty room. "Why come back for this?" He didn't have an answer, but something about the determination in her eyes unsettled him. 2 days later, Clara's movement staged its first rally. Hundreds of residents filled the square, holding banners and chanting slogans. Clara stood at the front, megaphone in hand, her voice echoing through the streets. "This is our heritage, our stories. If we don't fight for them, who will?" The crowd roared in agreement. Reporters snapped photos, and the footage streamed live online. Daniel, driving past in his black car, caught a glimpse of the rally. For a moment, he slowed, watching her standing tall among the crowd. Her hair whipped in the wind, her expression fierce and unyielding. He clenched the steering wheel. "You won't win, Clara," he whispered, though deep down, a flicker of doubt gnawed at him. Later that night, Clara sat at her desk, exhaustion weighing her down. Marco entered quietly, placing a cup of coffee beside her. "You're making waves," he said. Clara smiled faintly. "And storms," Marco chuckled, fitting, considering his name. Clara's smile faded. "Sometimes I wonder if this is really about the neighborhood, or if it's about proving him wrong, about finally standing for what I should have stood for years ago." Marco studied her for a long moment. "Maybe it's both, but as long as you're true to the cause, it doesn't matter what brought you here." Clara nodded, staring down at her sketches. In the lines and curves, she saw not just buildings, but her father's face, his voice urging her onward. She would not stop, not now. The backlash came swiftly. Within days of the rally, Clara noticed anonymous flyers appearing across the neighborhood. They accused her of mismanaging donations, of using the preservation cause as a platform for revenge against Daniel. A whisper campaign spread online, painting her as an opportunist, clinging to old bricks out of bitterness. Clara clenched her fists as she scrolled through the comments one night. "Billionaire's ex-wife plays martyr," one headline sneered. Another called her a romantic fool standing in the way of progress. She slammed her laptop shut, her chest heaving. For a moment, the doubts clawed at her. What if people believed it? What if all her efforts collapsed under the weight of rumor? Marco found her like that, her head in her hands. "He's trying to drown you out," he said quietly. "Daniel," she whispered. It wasn't a question. Marco nodded. "He's got money, connections, a whole machine at his disposal. But remember, machines don't have hearts. People do, and people are starting to listen to you." Clara lifted her head, her eyes rimmed red but burning with resolve. "Then I'll give them more reason to." The next morning, Clara stood before a panel of historians at the university. She had spent the night assembling research documents, photographs, old city records her father had collected. "These buildings are not just structures," she said, her voice gaining strength as she flipped through the slides. "They are testaments to immigrant resilience, to cultural diversity. Demolishing them would erase chapters of this city's story." The historians exchanged glances, some leaning forward with interest. By the end of the presentation, a few even offered to write op-eds in major papers. Clara walked out with a stack of promises and contacts. Each one felt like a brick laid in the foundation of something bigger than herself. Meanwhile, in his office, high above Manhattan, Daniel listened as Lydia summarized the situation. "Your PR team has been working overtime, but the tide is shifting. Clara's narrative is gaining traction. She's got academics, activists, and even some politicians starting to echo her points." Daniel leaned back in his chair, expression tight. "And the investors? Growing nervous? Some are questioning whether this project will face regulatory delays. They're worried about reputation damage." Daniel's jaw ticked. "They'll calm down once they see progress on the ground." But later, when he was alone, he pulled up Clara's latest interview. She was standing in front of a mural, painted decades ago by local children, her hand brushing lightly against the faded colors as she spoke about preserving identity. For a moment, Daniel couldn't look away. She spoke with a conviction that unnerved him. It wasn't performance, it was belief. And belief, he realized uneasily, was harder to demolish than brick. The following week, Clara and her group organized a walking tour of the neighborhood. Dozens showed up: residents, journalists, even curious tourists. Clara guided them through narrow alleys, pointing out architectural details, telling stories her father used to tell her. "This balcony," she explained, gesturing upward, "was crafted by a blacksmith who fled Europe during the war. He poured his memories into the ironwork. Look closely, you'll see the initials of his children woven into the design." People leaned in, snapping photos, murmuring in admiration. By the end of the tour, Clara's inbox overflowed with volunteers and donations. That night, a prominent newspaper ran a feature. "Preservationist Clara Lee fights to save Queens, Seoul." The headlines spread across the city like wildfire. Daniel read the article at breakfast, his fork poised above his plate but unmoving. The journalist had painted Clara not as a bitter ex-wife, but as a visionary. They called her the voice of memory in a city obsessed with money. He tossed the paper aside, appetite gone. For the first time, he felt the ground shift beneath him. He had built an empire on confidence, on the certainty that money could silence anything, but Clara was proving otherwise. And what unsettled him most wasn't the potential loss of profits. It was the realization that she might have been right all along. Still, Daniel wasn't ready to yield. That evening, He summoned his legal team. "Find me a way to fast-track demolition permits," he ordered. "Push through zoning approvals. If we move quickly, she won't have time to stop us." His lawyers nodded, already flipping through binders. Daniel's expression was calm, but his mind buzzed. He wasn't just fighting to build towers, he was fighting her, and a part of himself that didn't want to admit defeat. Back at her apartment, Clara collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion tugging at her. Emma, her neighbor's little girl, had dropped off a drawing of the street, complete with smiling faces and colorful storefronts. Clara pinned it to her wall, tears prickling at her eyes. This was why she fought. Not for revenge, not for pride, but for the children who deserved to inherit more than glass and steel. She whispered into the quiet room, as if her father could still hear, "I won't let him take this from us." And with that vow, she turned back to her desk, drafting a new plan, her resolve unbreakable. Clara's phone buzzed nonstop for the better part of the week. Every ping was a small avalanche, volunteers confirming shifts, donors asking where to send checks, reporters requesting interviews, a city council aide asking for documentation. It was chaotic, it was alive, and it burned away the last of the numbness that had kept her small for so long. She organized a legal team, pro bono attorneys who smelled a precedent and wanted it. There was Alina Morales, a soft-spoken public interest lawyer with a stubborn jaw and an impressive record of winning community injunctions, and Malik Ahmed, a constitutional scholar who liked to say that cities remembered the wrong things unless people taught them how to remember correctly. Together they filed an emergency stop-work petition citing improper permit notice and an environmental assessment that had been curtailed. The law moved slow and bureaucratic, but it moved, and for a little while it put machinery and promises on hold. Clara found time between interviews and court filings to listen. She sat on stoops and in back rooms, displayed slideshows at the community center, and let long-forgotten neighbors tell their stories into her recorder. Old Mrs. Hahn, 82, and sharper than most people half her age, told of a bakery that had sold mooncakes to soldiers returning from war. Jamal, who ran the corner deli, spoke about how the neighborhood had wrapped him when his wife died, and how he'd wrapped the neighborhood back. Each story stitched flesh onto the abstract lines of Clara's blueprints. A fundraising benefit organized by a neighborhood arts collective. Clara introduced the documentary footage of her father hunched over his drafting table, hands scarred with decades of pencil lead. The footage made people close their eyes. It made a few in the room, Daniel included, swallow hard. He had not expected to be invited. Lydia's assistant had mistaken his RSVP for curiosity and slipped his name onto the guest list. He had almost canceled, but something in him had wanted to see, to witness what she had been fighting for. Inside the small black box theater, the crowd hummed. Overhead lights softened. Clara's voice, steady and raw, carried through the room. "This is not an abstraction. It's not a prop for nostalgia. It's where my father and hundreds of others lived, loved, worked, buried their dead, raised children, and arrived in a new country with nothing but a language and hope." When the film ended, people lingered, moved slowly toward one another, sharing memories, money, and the urgent desire to keep the place alive, outside. As people filed into the night, a man in a dark hoodie slipped out of the crowd and began to post flyers along the perimeter. "You can't stop progress, and don't let the past hold back our children." The tone was menacing, not directly violent, but designed to intimidate. A week later, on a Tuesday morning, a different kind of paper arrived on Clara's doorstep, an envelope with no return address, and inside a single typed note: "Stop. Walk away. We can make this easy." No signature, no threat of bodily harm, but the message threaded through her stomach like cold copper. She took the note to Alina, hand shaking. Alina scanned the line, then looked up with a measured anger that matched Clara's fear. "This is intimidation," Alina said. "We'll document it. We'll go to the police if it escalates. But also, she paused, meeting Clara's eyes, we'll use it. This will show the city what's at stake. People will rally behind the threatened. Clara hated being used as an emblem. She hated that the danger of a note could perform so easily for the cameras. Still, she couldn't deny the practicalities. The more visible the intimidation, the more obvious the stakes. She posted a photo of the note on the movement's social feed with a short caption. "They are trying to scare us. They will not succeed." The response was immediate and fierce. Offers of neighborhood patrols, donations for emergency signage, and messages from organizers offering legal advice. Daniel read the reposted photo on his morning briefing. The note's typewriter font stark on the screen. For days, his advisors had suggested he make a public gesture, donate to a local school, sponsor a community fair, something to put a glossy bomb on the headlines. He had snorted at the suggestions. He had assumed people would forget. But the way Clara's voice hardened when she posted that note lodged behind his ribs. That afternoon, a terse briefing email hit his inbox. The demolition schedule had to be advanced to prevent any more protests from blocking progress. Victoria, named Daniel, always used like a bristle against his teeth, had pressured him. Victor's hand in the board was strong and patient. He wanted the land parceled and flipped, and he wanted it fast, before sentiment could calcify into law. Victor's argument was cold and sharp. Delay and yield to nostalgia, and profits would bleed away. Daniel also had to consider reputation, though he rarely admitted it. A threatened activist was one thing. A threatened activist who had turned the city's conversation against you was different. He'd seen the numbers fall across weeks and felt the tick of influence turn away. Investors started to request private meetings. He needed to stop the narrative before it became permanent. So when he called Claire in action, he had not allowed himself to do in years. His voice surprised him. It wasn't smooth and commanding. It was careful, an instrument tuned to a fragile string. "Clara, I saw the note," he said. "Are you okay?" There was a pause, heavy as a winter sky. "I'll be fine," Clara said. She hadn't expected him to call. The sound of his voice had the power still to unsettle her. Anger fought with a residual protectiveness she hadn't wanted to admit. "I'm having security sweep the perimeter tonight," he added. "You should accept it." She pulled the phone away from her ear, because she could suddenly hear the old cadence in his tone, the way he had said 100 promises he didn't keep. "Why now?" she asked, voice flat. "Because you don't deserve to be intimidated," he said. "No one does." It was small. It was inadequate, but it was also a fissure. The offer of his resources set the messaging engines talking from, "Isn't it convenient?" to, "Could he be serious?" Journalists smelled drama. Supporters sniffed hope. Clara accepted the security only because the neighborhood needed the optics of safety. She didn't trust Daniel's motives. But when two burly men arrived, that night, polite professional, showing credentials and a phone number, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. The possibility that the man in charge of the cranes might not only be a bulldozer of dreams, but could also, however belatedly, throw his weight between a community and violence. Even so, she kept him at arm's length. Daniel's presence hovered like a rumor. She didn't thank him publicly. She didn't let him near the posters or the legal folders. Her movement belonged to the community. She refused to risk its credibility on one man's late-stage conscience. Victor, watching from another suite of glass and shadow, noticed. He wasn't angry at Daniel for sending protection. He was wary. This was theater, and any note of benevolence could pull votes back to the man he wanted to depose. So he doubled down on his plan. In late-night calls with shadowy partners consultants who specialized in market solutions, he authorized a leak of old permit irregularities from a decade prior, a project where an earlier storm venture had cut corners. If Victor could make the headlines mirror whatever Clara alleged, He could use the chaos to force a board reconfiguration and seize control. The leak hit the channels on a Thursday morning, an unsigned dossier, heavy with scanned documents, and a central claim that a prior storm project skirted safety reviews. The headline suggested negligence, maybe worse. Overnight, the opposition to Daniel's current project swelled with new fuel. The city councilmen who had been cautious were now openly whispering about investigations. Daniel tasted the metallic temps of panic. He had long understood the language of leverage, of contracts, of influence. But seeing documents and questions surface that he hadn't expected, evidence that could threaten licenses, Ignite probes moved him in a way that logic could not soothe. He found himself at his father's old record, Cabinet Daniel. Senior had been a man who wore his moral compromises in crisp suits, but Daniel pulled a file instead. One of Clara's old sketches that had once sat framed in their home. He thumbed the corner of the paper, as if he could feel the memory there. That night, when the board convened urgently, Daniel looked at Victor across the table and felt the old, familiar hunger for absolute control. He could fight Victor with lawyers, he could buy influence, channel money through the right committees, and bury the story. It was everything he had built his life to do. He could weather this. But watching the footage of Clara speaking on the steps of the community center, of old men pressing their hands against the brick like they were saying goodbye, an unexpected question rose like smoke inside him. What did he want to be left with? Buildings? A ledger? Or something that outlived his balance sheet? The board wanted answers. The cameras wanted conflict. The neighborhood wanted sanctuary. Victor wanted victory. And Clara wanted the story of her father's people to remain written in stone. The coming weeks would make choices visible. For now, the city had paused. The machines were quiet at dawn. The injunction held. In the lull, people cleaned the chalked sidewalks, taped flyers of thanks to lampposts, and, quietly, prayed. Daniel couldn't sleep. In the quiet of his tower, he kept imagining Clara's hand on the sycamore trunk, the way she had traced the grooves of brick and given them names. It lodged into him like a splinter, small, painful, impossible to ignore. He didn't know if that splinter would become a wound he would nurse or a truth he would let change him. But the first day, the machines sat idle. The world seemed to breathe. And in the hold between demolition and decision, a new kind of fight was taking root, one that might yet require more than money to win. The courthouse steps smelled faintly of exhaust and wet stone when Clara emerged into the daylight, clutching a binder heavy with photocopied permits, photographs, and affidavits from longtime residents. The reporters who had been loitering all morning swarmed like gulls, spotting bread. Ms. Lee, what evidence are you presenting? Do you believe Storm Enterprises acted illegally? Clara lifted her chin. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she began to speak. Today we filed supplemental evidence with the City Council and the Preservation Board. These documents show irregularities in the permit process and outline the historic significance of multiple buildings marked for demolition. This is more than red tape, it's proof that due diligence was ignored, that our heritage is at risk for the sake of speed and profit. The cameras flashed. A buzz rippled through the crowd. She could see, in their eyes, that her words were sticking, not vanishing into the usual void. One reporter shouted above the rest, "And what about your ex-husband? Do you believe Daniel Storm knew about these irregularities?" Clara hesitated. Her instinct was to lash out, to say yes, to name him the villain everyone already assumed he was. But she forced herself to breathe. This fight wasn't about revenge. "I believe this is bigger than one man," she said at last. "It's about accountability. It's about choosing what kind of city we want to live in." The restraint in her answer made the story even stronger. By evening, clips of her speech ran on every major network. The headlines split between her accusations and Daniel's silence. Daniel watched the footage from his office. Glass of scotch, untouched on the desk beside him. The camera had lingered on Clara's face, size fierce, voice steady. For a moment, he had almost been proud of her. Then he remembered that every word she spoke was an arrow aimed at his. Empire. Lydia entered quietly, setting down a folder. The council is opening an inquiry. Investors are restless. And Victor's been talking behind closed doors. He's hinting that you've lost your edge. Daniel's jaw tightened. Victor doesn't run this company. No, Lydia said carefully. But he wants to. Daniel shoved the folder aside, rising to pace before the window. Below him, the city gleamed. Towers he had built, slicing into the sky. He had always believed this view was proof that he had won, that he had been right to choose money over sentiment. But now, when he looked, he couldn't shake the echo of Clara's voice. Heritage, memory, accountability, for the first time. The skyline felt hollow. Clara's campaign gathered speed like a storm rolling down river, with the help of historians and activists. She organized an exhibit in an abandoned storefront, filling it with old photographs, oral histories, and artifacts salvaged from threatened buildings. Families brought heirlooms. Children painted murals. On opening night, the line to enter stretched around the block. Journalists filmed the crowds, capturing the palpable sense of community. Clara stood at the entrance, greeting visitors, her exhaustion masked by adrenaline. Inside, one wall was dedicated to her father. His sketches hung in simple frames, alongside letters he had written to city officials decades ago, begging for preservation funding. Clara touched the edge of one letter, whispering a private promise. I'm doing it, Dad. I'm finally doing it. Halfway through the evening, she froze. Across the room, framed by the glow of hanging bulbs, stood Daniel. He had come unannounced, without his usual entourage, his expression unreadable. For a moment their eyes met, and time folded. Clara remembered late nights at the drafting table, when she had shown him these very sketches, and he had smiled indulgently before turning back to his spreadsheets. Now, his gaze lingered, softer, heavier, as if he was finally seeing what she had tried to show him years ago. Clara turned away, forcing herself back into the crowd. She couldn't afford to be disarmed. Not now. Victor watched the news coverage with a predator's satisfaction. The more Clara spoke, the weaker Daniel looked. And the weaker Daniel looked, the easier it would be for Victor to rally the board against him. But Victor also recognized opportunity. Clara was an asset, brilliant, articulate, beloved by the press. If she could be discredited, it would not only crush her movement, but also bury Daniel beneath the rubble. He picked up the phone, dialing a number few people knew he had. I need every file you can find on Clara Lee, he said smoothly. Personal, financial, anything that can bend in the right light. A week later, Clara sat in the community center surrounded by boxes of documents, her eyes gritty from sleepless nights. Marco entered with takeout, setting the bag down beside her. You need to eat, he said firmly. I need to finish cataloging, Clara countered, flipping through another stack of yellowed photographs. If we can link these two city records, it'll prove Clara. Marco's tone softened. You're burning yourself out. She rubbed her temples, sighing. If I stop moving, it all catches up. The noise, the doubt, She trailed off, unwilling to say his name. Marco studied her. You still love him? The words landed like a stone. Clara stiffened. I don't, she lied. Marco didn't press, but the truth hung heavy in the room. Meanwhile, Daniel sat alone in his penthouse, the city sprawling silent outside his windows. He poured a second glass of scotch, but the burn didn't settle him. Instead, he pulled out one of Clara's old notebooks, left behind in a forgotten drawer. Flipping through, he found sketches of the very buildings now slated for demolition, detailed renderings she had drawn in their early years together. Notes scrawled in the margins described the cultural significance, the personal histories. He had dismissed them then. Now, they cut through him like blades. He closed the notebook, pressing it to his chest, an unfamiliar heaviness pressing down. He didn't know if it was regret, guilt, or something more dangerous, longing. The next morning, Daniel surprised his board by announcing he would personally tour the threatened neighborhood. Lydia nearly dropped her pen. "Sir, that's risky. The protesters will let them." Daniel interrupted. "If I don't see it myself, I can't fight it." As his car pulled into the neighborhood, residents gathered, shouting slogans, some jeered. But Daniel kept walking, his polished shoes crunching against cracked pavement. He passed storefronts Clara had described, families leaning out of windows, children clutching parents' hands. For the first time, he didn't see obstacles. He saw lives, and with every step, the certainty that had once been his armor began to crack. The neighborhood smelled of rain-soaked brick and fried food from corner stalls when Daniel walked its narrow streets for the second time that week. He wore no suit, no tie, just a dark coat that drew less attention. Yet people still stared. Some spat curses under their breath. Others simply looked away, as if his presence tainted the air. He deserved it. At the far end of the block, a mural caught his eye, a sprawling canvas of colors, depicting generations who had lived there, shopkeepers, musicians, immigrants with weary smiles. He paused, tracing the painted outline of a child's handprint, and something inside him fractured. He had spent years erasing these kinds of places, flattening them into blueprints and profit margins. For the first time, he wondered if he had been building an empire of emptiness. Clara saw him from across the street. Her first instinct was fury. How dare he show up here, among people whose homes he threatened? She marched over, ignoring the drizzle that dampened her hair. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, voice low but sharp. Daniel turned, rain dripping from his hairline. Looking. Clara scoffed. "These are not exhibits for you to tour, Daniel. These are lives, families, memories." "I know." His admission startled her, quiet and stripped of arrogance. "I should have seen it sooner." For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of water gurgling down gutters. Clara studied him, searching for the glib smirk she had grown to hate. But it wasn't there. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed. "Words are easy," she said finally, voice steady. "What matters is what you do." Daniel nodded, accepting the blow. "Then watch me." Victor watched the encounter from a black SUV parked half a block away. His driver leaned against the steering wheel, pretending to check messages, while Victor's eyes narrowed. Daniel's hesitation, his softened tone, his willingness to be seen in this neighborhood, those were cracks in his armor. Cracks. Victor intended to widen until Daniel shattered. He pulled out his phone and dialed a contact in City Hall. "Push the leak," he ordered. "Financial records, offshore accounts, make sure they land in the right inboxes, and find a way to tie Clara to it. Guilt by association." The plan was simple. Ruin Daniel publicly, taint Clara by proximity, and leave himself the sole man standing by evening. Clara was back at the community center, drenched and exhausted. Volunteers bustled around, updating social media pages and cataloging petitions. Marco handed her a towel and a worried look. "You saw him again?" he said. Clara hesitated, then nodded. He looked different. "Different doesn't erase who he is," Marco pressed. "You know that, right?" Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to agree, to hold on to her anger like a shield. But part of her traitorous fragility seen sincerity flicker in Daniel's eyes, and that part whispered that maybe, just maybe, people could change. She shook the thought away. "I don't have time for distractions. We're close to forcing the council's vote." Marco didn't argue, but his expression said everything. The next morning, chaos erupted. Headlines screamed about financial misconduct at Storm Enterprises' shell companies. Offshore accounts, whispers of tax evasion. Stock prices plummeted. Reporters camped outside Daniel's building, demanding answers. Clara read the articles with a sinking heart. The documents looked damning, and though she despised Daniel's empire, something felt off. The timing was too precise, the leaks too polished. By noon, she received an anonymous email with attachments, copies of the leaked files, accompanied by a note. "Look closer. The truth is buried under the noise." Clara's instincts flared. She spread the documents across her desk, analyzing numbers and signatures, cross-checking dates. Hours passed. Then she found it, a subtle inconsistency, a signature style she recognized. It wasn't Daniel's accountant's. It was someone else's handiwork. Victor. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his penthouse with Lydia and a cluster of lawyers. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair, knuckles white. "They think I'm finished," he muttered, "unless we disprove this fast." "You might be," Lydia admitted grimly. Daniel's phone buzzed with a new message. He opened it, frowning. An address, no name. A second later, another text. "If you want the truth, meet Mita," against his advisor's protests. Daniel left the meeting and drove himself to the Addressa, dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city. Inside, Clara sat in a booth, a stack of papers before her. "You called me?" he asked warily. "I called you because this isn't your scandal," Clara replied, sliding the papers across. "I compared signatures. Someone forged these leaks to look like your records, and I think I know who." Daniel skimmed the documents, eyes narrowing. "Victor." Clara nodded. "He benefits if you fall. He benefits if both of us fall, for the first time in years." They were allies again, united by necessity. The air between them shifted. Daniel leaned forward, voice quieter. "Why help me? After everything I've done, why not let me drown?" Clara met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Because this isn't just about you. If Victor destroys you, he destroys the project too. And that project is my father's legacy. I won't let him win." Something flickered in Daniel's chest, a mix of admiration and shame. He realized she wasn't here to save him. She was here to save what he had once dismissed as worthless. And yet, she was still saving him too. That night, Clara returned home to find an envelope slipped under her door. Inside were photographs, grainy shots of her and Daniel at the diner, sitting close, heads bent together. Across the photos, in bold red ink, someone had scrawled, "Traitor." Her stomach lurched. Victor wasn't just attacking Daniel, he was coming for her. She clenched the photos in her fist, fire igniting in her veins. If Victor thought intimidation would silence her, he had chosen the wrong woman. The conference hall of the Queen's Cultural Center was brimming with tension. The air itself felt heavy, as if weighed down by centuries of history, pressing against the glint of polished marble floors and the buzzing of cameras. Reporters lined the back rows, their lenses already aimed, their pens poised for a headline. Investors, city council members, and community activists filled the remaining seats, each of them buzzing with expectation. At the center of it all stood Daniel Storm. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, but for the first time in years, the confidence in his stance seemed earned, not performed. His hands rested firmly on the podium, not to dominate, but to anchor himself against the storm that was about to break. Beside him, at the far end of the stage, Clara adjusted her notes, the reflection of stage lights gleaming faintly in her eyes. She hadn't agreed to this. Willingly, Daniel had pushed, insisted that the truth needed a stage, but she was here, and in her heart, she knew there was no turning back. Victor's presence filled the room before he even spoke. Leaning back casually in his chair at the front row, his smirk cut through the tension like a blade. He was the perfect image of charm corrupted. Sleek dark suit, a silk tie too bright for the occasion, and eyes that glimmered with the cold calculation of a predator who had already set the trap. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel began, his voice carrying over the hush, "we are here today to discuss the future of the Queen's Heritage District. There has been much debate, some of it honest, some of it twisted. Today, you will hear the truth." A ripple moved through the audience. Everyone knew Daniel Storm's reputation, the ruthless developer who turned history into glass towers. And yet here he was, talking about heritage, preservation, and truth. Victor chuckled under his breath, loud enough for the microphones to pick it up. The sound rippled across the hall, mocking, dismissive. Daniel ignored him, continuing, "For too long, I measured success in profit margins and skyscrapers. But profit cannot replace memory. It cannot replace the home where families laughed, the street where stories were born, the corner cafe where time seemed to stop. These things," he gestured to the large projection behind him, "showing photographs of the district, cannot be replicated once destroyed." Clara looked at him then, really looked, and for a moment, she almost forgot the years of betrayal, the walls of arrogance he had once built around himself. The man speaking now wasn't the Daniel she had divorced. He was different, humbled, stripped bare, perhaps even honest. But Victor wasn't about to let this transformation happen unchecked. He rose smoothly, his smile widening as he approached the stage without invitation. "Beautiful words, Daniel, almost poetic. But let's not pretend you suddenly found your conscience, shall we?" The crowd stirred. Cameras turned to follow Victor as he mounted the stage, his movements smooth, practiced. "This man," Victor said, pointing at Daniel with casual cruelty, "is no savior of heritage. He's a fraud. And I have the evidence." A murmur of shock rippled through the audience. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he did not flinch. Clara's stomach sank. She knew Victor had been digging, twisting. Victor pulled out a folder thick with papers. "Here we have financial records. Projects where Daniel Storm funneled money through shell companies. Projects that buried neighborhoods under concrete. Families displaced, promises broken. This is the real Daniel Storm, greedy, ruthless, incapable of change." Gasps echoed through the hall. Reporters scribbled furiously, the click of cameras growing manic. Clara stepped forward, her heart pounding. "You're twisting the truth, Victor. Everyone here knows developers operate through subsidiaries. It's not proof of corruption." Victor's gaze flicked to her, his smirk growing sharper. "Ah, Clara, the loyal defender. Or should I say, the naive dreamer. Tell me, how long before you realize he's using you again, just like before?" The words struck her harder than she expected. Memories surged, long nights waiting for Daniel to come home, dreams dismissed with a wave of his hand, the slow erosion of her voice in a marriage that had once promised partnership. For a moment, she faltered. Daniel stepped closer, his voice steady. "Enough, Victor. This isn't about Clara. This isn't even about me. This is about the truth, and you're terrified of it." Victor laughed, spreading his arms. "The truth. The truth is, you're finished. Once these documents hit the press, your empire collapses, and Clara's little preservation fantasy burns with it." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. But instead of rage, his expression softened with resolve. He turned to the audience, speaking directly to them. "Yes, I made mistakes. I built without thought for what I destroyed. But I will not deny it. I will not hide it. And I will not repeat it." He paused, looking back at Clara. His voice softened. "I failed Clara once, by dismissing what she cherished most. I will not fail again. The Queen's Heritage District will stand not as a monument to me, but to the people who lived, loved, and built their lives there." The silence that followed was deafening. Victor sneered, realizing the shift, and with a flick of his wrist, he slammed the folder shut. "You think words can erase what you've done? Fine. Let's see if your investors believe your little redemption speech." He stormed off the stage. But the damage wasn't what he expected. Instead of gears, the audience erupted into applause, hesitant at first, then swelling, filling the hall. Reporters shouted questions, not about corruption, but about Daniel's plan for preservation. Clara's throat tightened. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to lay himself bare, to admit not just two business mistakes, but two personal ones. As the applause roared, Daniel stepped back from the podium, his eyes finding hers in the chaos. There was no smugness in his gaze, no demand for recognition, only a silent plea. "Do you believe me now?" And for the first time in years, Clara didn't know the answer. The conference room still buzzed with echoes long after the press conference had ended. Flashbulbs, microphones, and sharp questions had been the battlefield where Daniel Storm admitted before the world that he had been wrong. He had spoken Clara's name in front of reporters, acknowledging her vision and pledging his support to preserve the old district. It should have been a triumph. For Clara, it was complicated. That evening, she stood by the tall windows of her modest office near the edge of Queens. The golden glow of sunset fell across stacks of sketches, research papers, and photographs she had collected over the years. Pictures of brick-lined streets, stained glass windows, and iron-wrought balconies, each one a piece of her father's legacy. And yet, even as she gazed at them, her thoughts drifted to Daniel. She replayed his words from the press conference, the firm way he had said, "I was blind." Clara Lee was right. They had shocked investors, rattled the board, and left journalists scrambling. But words, Clara reminded herself, were only words. Daniel Storm was a man who had built empires on promises, many of which were made to be broken. Her phone buzzed. A new headline appeared on the screen. Storm Enterprises halts $2 billion redevelopment project. Clara's breath caught. She clicked the article. It detailed Daniel's decision, announced just hours after the press conference, to freeze construction on the lucrative commercial project that had threatened the old district. The piece described mounting tension within his board of directors, whispers of investor panic, and the possibility of lawsuits. For the first time in years, Clara felt a crack in the marble facade of Daniel Storm. He had never sacrificed profit for principle. Could this be real? Or was it a tactic, another calculated move to regain her trust, to restore his tarnished image? Her heart wavered, torn between skepticism and the faintest flicker of hope. Daniel, meanwhile, sat alone in his penthouse, city lights glittering below like a restless ocean. A glass of untouched whiskey glistened in his hand. He had spent the entire day in a storm of arguments with shareholders and legal advisors. They had called him reckless, sentimental, insane, for the first time in a decade. Daniel had ignored them all. What haunted him wasn't the prospect of financial loss, it was Clara's face. The look in her eyes when she'd seen him on that demolition site, the betrayal carved into her expression, had never left him. And now, the way she had watched him at the press conference, guarded, questioning, unwilling to believe too quickly. He deserved that skepticism. He had earned it with years of arrogance and neglect, but it made his resolve sharper. This time, he would not stop at words. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. "You'll see, Clara," he whispered. "I'm not the man I was." The next week brought turbulence. Victor Chen, Daniel's old rival, and the predator circling this entire ordeal, sensed weakness. With Storm Enterprises halting its flagship project, Victor moved quickly, holding private meetings with discontented shareholders. Rumors spread like wildfire. Daniel had lost his edge. Daniel was crumbling under pressure. Daniel was letting a woman dictate billion-dollar decisions. Financial journals debated his fall. Stock prices dipped. Clara read every article with a mixture of unease and guilt. She had never intended for her fight to cost him his empire. All she wanted was to save the district, to protect her father's legacy. Yet here Daniel was, bleeding power and influence because he had chosen, for once, to stand on her side. One evening, as Clara walked through the cobblestone streets of the threatened district, she saw families lighting lanterns outside their homes. A spontaneous gathering had formed, residents celebrating the temporary halt of demolition. Children ran with sparklers, old men raised cups of tea, and music floated through the night air. Clara's chest tightened. This was what she was fighting for. But the sight also reminded her of Daniel, sitting alone in his skyscraper, vilified for protecting what these people cherished. Was she beginning to see him differently? Or was she simply afraid of what her heart still wanted? A few days later, she got her answer. It was raining when Daniel appeared at her office door. His suit was soaked, his tie askew, and there were shadows beneath his eyes. Clara froze, startled by how human he looked, how stripped of the armor he usually wore. "Can I come in?" His voice was quieter than she remembered. Clara hesitated, then stepped aside. Daniel walked in, dripping water onto the floor, and stood among the piles of sketches and photos. He picked up a photograph of her father kneeling beside a restored archway, smiling. Daniel stared at it for a long time before setting it down with surprising care. "I canceled the project," he said finally. "You probably saw the news." "I did." Clara folded her arms, her tone guarded. "But you've made big promises before, Daniel. Why should I believe this time is different?" He met her gaze, his eyes raw. "Because this time, I have nothing to gain. I've already lost investors. The board is furious. My reputation is in free fall, but I don't care. Not if it means destroying what mattered to you." What mattered to him? He gestured toward the photo of her father. Clara's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stay steady. "You hurt me once by choosing money over everything else. I can't forget that overnight." Daniel nodded. "I don't expect you to. I'm not asking for forgiveness, not yet. I'm asking for a chance to prove I can be better, to prove I can fight for something that isn't about profit." The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the patter of rain against the windows. Clara studied him, his disheveled suit, the sincerity etched in his expression. For the first time, she wondered if Daniel's storm truly could change. But outside, forces gathered against them. Victor was not content with watching Daniel falter. He wanted to finish him, and the easiest way to break Daniel was through Clara. One night, as Clara locked up her office, she noticed a dark car idling across the street. Its tinted windows reflected the lamplight, hiding whoever sat inside. Her pulse quickened. She had been followed more than once in recent days, shadowy figures lingering too long near her. She brushed it off as paranoid, till a threatening note slid under her office door the next morning. "Walk away, or you'll regret it." Clara's hands shook as she read the words. She knew exactly who was behind it. Victor had made his move, and with that, the war was no longer just about a district. It had become personal. Clara sat at her desk long after the threatening note had been tucked away in a drawer, but the words still burned in her mind like neon against the dark. "Walk away, or you'll regret it." She had faced Daniel's arrogance, public scrutiny, even the risk of failure. But this was different. This was menace, cold and deliberate. She thought of her father, of the promise she had made at his bedside to protect the old district. Fear coiled in her stomach, but beneath it burned defiance. She would not be silenced. Still, she couldn't shake the thought of Daniel. He had chosen to stand beside her, and because of that, Victor had set his sights on her. Clara knew the kind of ruthless games Victor Chen played in the financial world. If he was willing to resort to threats, then she was in real danger. Her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "Are you safe? Can I come by?" Clara hesitated, pride warring with instinct. She had always wanted to prove she could stand on her own, especially against Daniel. But tonight, staring at the shadow of the note, she typed back, "Yes, please." When Daniel arrived, the storm outside mirrored the tension inside her chest. His presence filled the room, towering, controlled, but his sharp eyes immediately scanned her, as if searching for hidden wounds. "You got something, didn't you?" he asked, voice low. Clara swallowed. She handed him the note. Daniel's jaw tightened as he read it. For a moment, silence pressed heavy between them. Then he crumpled the paper in his fist. "Victor," he muttered. "He's behind this." "Of course it's him," Clara said, trying to sound steadier than she felt. "But I'm not going to back down." Daniel turned to her, fierce. "I won't let him touch you." The certainty in his voice startled her. This was not the Daniel she remembered, the man who measured everything in dollars, who abandoned dreams for profit. This was someone else, someone who looked at her as though she was the only thing that mattered. "Daniel," Clara started, but he cut her off. "No, listen." He stepped closer, his voice roughened by anger and something softer underneath. "I've made mistakes. I've been blind. But I will not let you fight this battle alone. If Victor wants war, he'll have to go through me first." Clara met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw not just arrogance or power, but a man who was willing to put himself at risk. It unsettled her, because it chipped away at the wall she had built to keep him out. The following days were relentless. Victor tightened the noose, spreading rumors that Daniel had lost control of his empire, that Clara was manipulating him to gain influence. Headlines screamed about the fall of Daniel's storm, and investors whispered about jumping ship. Clara watched from the sidelines, guilt gnawing at her. Every time she saw Daniel stand before the press, shielding her project, she wondered if she had asked too much of him. Yet, Daniel never wavered. He attended meetings with preservation societies by her side, sat through endless planning sessions, even walked the crumbling streets with her, asking quiet questions about the history carved into each brick. One evening, they visited the old theater, once the heart of the district, now boarded up and rotting. Clara unlocked the heavy doors, and dust swirled like spirits in the beam of her flashlight. "My father used to bring me here," Clara whispered, her voice trembling with memory. "He'd tell me these walls held every laugh, every note of music, every love story ever played on this stage." He said preserving it was like preserving the soul of the city. Daniel stood silently, the weight of her words pressing into him. He walked to the stage, running his hand along the cracked wood. For the first time, he seemed stripped of the armor of a businessman, standing instead as a man confronted with what he had almost destroyed. "I never understood," he said quietly. "I thought profit was everything. But this—" He turned toward, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "This is alive. It's history, Clara, and I almost erased it." Clara felt her chest tighten. There was raw sincerity in his voice, a tone she had rarely heard before. And in that moment, she truly believed, that he was changing. But Victor was far from finished. A week later, Daniel was summoned to a board meeting. He entered to find half the directors already swayed by Victor's poison. Documents lay on the table, evidence of falling stock. Lawsuits pending from contractors, angry letters from investors. One director leaned forward. "Daniel, if you don't reverse your decision and resume the project, we'll have no choice but to move for your removal." Daniel's pulse hammered. He glanced at the papers, at the men and women who once followed his every command. They expected him to fold, to abandon Clara's cause, and return to the ruthless empire builder he had always been. Instead, Daniel stood. "Then remove me," he said, voice steady, "because I will not betray her. I will not betray the city." Gasps rippled through the room. Victor, seated smugly at the end of the table, faltered for the briefest second. He hadn't expected Daniel to choose principle over power. When the meeting ended in chaos, Daniel walked out lighter than he had in years. For the first time, he was free of the cage he had built for himself, free of a world where money meant everything. Clara heard the news that night. Daniel had risked his position, his empire, for her cause. Tears pricked her eyes as she sat in her office, staring at the sketches of the old district. She remembered the man she once loved, the one she thought had vanished forever. But maybe, just maybe, he had been buried under ambition, waiting for the right fight to bring him back. And as she thought of him walking away from the boardroom with nothing but conviction, her heart whispered what her mind refused to admit: she was falling for him again. The night before the final hearing on the district's fate, the city buzzed with anticipation. News crews hovered near the courthouse steps, hungry for spectacle. Some framed the battle as David versus Goliath, Clara, the unknown architect, fighting for her father's legacy against the titan Daniel Storm and his empire. Others twisted it, further painting Clara as Daniel's pawn, suggesting this was all theater to salvage his collapsing image. Inside Clara's apartment, maps and sketches were spread across every surface. She sat cross-legged on the floor, pencil smudges on her hands, exhaustion carved into her face. But her eyes burned with determination. Daniel arrived late, still wearing the weight of his boardroom showdown. His tie hung loose, his shoulders tense. Yet when he saw her hunched over her drawings, he paused at the doorway, struck by the ferocity in her focus. "You should rest," he said softly. Clara didn't look up. "I can't. If tomorrow doesn't go right, everything we've worked for, everything my father worked for, will be gone." Daniel walked in, lowering himself beside her. For a moment, they sat in silence amid the paper battlefield she had built. Then he reached for one of the sketches, the old theater restored, its marquee glowing against the night sky. "You're fighting for more than bricks and mortar," he murmured. "You're fighting for memory." Finally, Clara looked at him. The weariness in her face softened. "And you?" she asked quietly. "What are you fighting for?" Daniel's jaw flexed. He thought of the board, of the empire crumbling beneath his refusal to bow. He thought of Victor, circling like a vulture, waiting to feast on his downfall. And then he thought of her hands trembling but steady, her voice shaking but unyielding, her father's legacy shining through her eyes. "I'm fighting for us," he said simply. Clara's breath caught, but she turned away before he could read the storm in her eyes. There was no space for tenderness now. Tomorrow would decide everything. The hearing drew a crowd so thick that people spilled into the street, holding signs that read, "Save our history, and Storm must fall." Reporters shoved microphones at Clara and Daniel as they approached side by side. She wore a simple black suit, her hair pulled back, her face pale but resolute. Daniel, taller, exuded calm, though every step felt like a gamble. Inside, the council chamber buzzed with anticipation. Victor sat in the gallery, smug as a king awaiting coronation. His allies whispered among themselves, already savoring the kill. Clara presented first. Her voice was clear, threaded with emotion, but steady. She spoke of heritage, of culture, of the intangible wealth found in stories, not stock portfolios. She projected images of the district, the theater glowing, the cobblestone streets alive with music, children playing under lamplight. Each slide was a promise of what could be saved. People in the chamber leaned forward, some wiping tears. Even hardened council members shifted uneasily. Then Victor's attorney rose. He painted Clara as naive, insisting the district was beyond saving, a drain on city resources. He pointed to Daniel's past, his ruthless acquisitions, his history of tearing down to build luxury towers. "Can this man truly be trusted?" The attorney sneered, gesturing toward Daniel. Murmurs rippled through the room. All eyes turned to him. Daniel stood slowly. The silence was deafening. For years, he had ruled boardrooms with arrogance, silencing opposition with sheer force of will. But now, he spoke with something rarer, humility. "They're right about me," Daniel said, his voice even. "I have been ruthless. I have destroyed things I should have preserved. I let ambition blind me to what truly matters. And because of that, I lost not only a part of this city, but the woman who once believed in me. Gasps fluttered through the chamber. Clara froze, her heart slamming in her chest. But people can change, Daniel continued, his gaze sweeping the council. I stand here not as the man I was, but as the man I want to be. If you approve Clara's plan, I will fund it entirely. I will abandon the luxury development, absorb the financial loss, and dedicate my resources to ensuring this district thrives again. Even Victor blinked at that, caught off guard. Why? One council member asked skeptically. Daniel's eyes found Clara's. Because some things are worth more than money. Some things are priceless. The chamber erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Citizens cheered. Victor leaped from his seat, shouting about fraud, waving a folder. Lies. You can't trust him. He's laundering his image through her. Security moved to calm him, but Daniel remained composed. Clara, her voice trembling but sharp, turned toward Victor. You talk about lies, she said, stepping closer. But we know what you've done. Intimidation, threats, documents, forged to sabotage us. She lifted a folder of her own evade, gathered with Daniel's resources, exposing Victor's shell companies, his illegal land grabs. Gasps turned to outrage. Council members flipped through the documents as reporters swarmed. Victor's face went pale, his bravado collapsing under the weight of truth. The gavel came down. The vote was unanimous. The district would be preserved under Clara's plan. When the hearing adjourned, chaos erupted outside. Cameras flashed, questions flew, chants of celebration filled the air. Clara stood dazed at the steps, clutching her folder. Beside her, Daniel placed a steadying hand on her back. She looked up at him, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. For once, there was no arrogance, no calculation, just quiet sincerity. You did it, he said softly. We did it, she corrected, though part of her still struggled to accept how much he had changed. Victor was led away in disgrace, his empire crumbling as fast as Daniel's had been saved. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. As the crowd dispersed, Clara and Daniel walked down the steps together. The night air smelled of rain and triumph. Clara stopped at the bottom, turning to face him. This doesn't mean everything's fixed between us. Daniel nodded. I know. Trust isn't rebuilt in a day. She studied him, searching for cracks, for the man who once dismissed her dreams. Instead, she saw someone stripped bare, humbled by loss and tempered by conviction. But it's a start, Clara admitted quietly. Daniel's lips curved into a faint, almost boyish smile, the first she had seen in years. It's all I ask. They stood there in the glow of street lamps, not lovers rekindled, not strangers divided, but two people who had fought a war together and emerged, changed, and as the city roared around them, Clara felt something stir in her chestnut, the reckless love of youth, but something steadier, rooted in respect, in shared purpose. Perhaps, she thought, this was stronger. The district was safe. Her father's legacy lived on, and while the future with Daniel remained uncertain, it was open, and it was theirs to shape brick by brick, choice by choice.